Hello, and welcome to the Cryptocurrency News Channel. Today we're going to talk about Bitcoin, Segwit, and how fast it actually is, and how fast it could technically be. What Segwit is, because Segwit is not like Lightning or XRPL. It is not an off-chain transaction. It's not an off-chain solution where you have to reconcile with the actual chain. It is actually a modification or a soft fork to the actual Bitcoin protocol that actually lessens the amount of data per transaction so we can squeeze more of them per block. We're going to talk about the kind of like the implementation, what's it like right now, and how fast that could make Bitcoin. First of all, Segwit has significantly sped up Bitcoin. The number of Bitcoin transactions now per block is actually significantly greater than what it was in 2017 at our high per block. But there's less unconfirmed transactions for Bitcoin per block right now. Now, Segwit was actually one of the reasons that many of the Chinese miners actually didn't like this new protocol, and they actually made Bitcoin Cash. And their answer was probably a decent one, which they just decided to increase the number of megabytes per block for transactions, resulting in more transactions per block, which would make the cryptocurrency faster in terms of TPS. Bitcoin Cash is 32 megabytes, so it's per second. So it's a lot bigger and faster than Bitcoin, but it has its own problems starting at the top. But we're not really going to talk about Bitcoin Cash. We're going to be talking about Bitcoin, Segwit, and what's its purpose. So Bitcoin does most papers actually say about 7 transactions per second. Obviously, that's not enough. Ethereum does, I think, 2 or 3 times as much. Ripple, Tron, they all do like 1,500 transactions per second. And we know that Visa does about 24,000 transactions per second. Obviously, Visa's not blockchain. They have that new B2B thing, but they're not blockchain. They're just traditional. So they do about 24,000 transactions per second. So Bitcoin has a long way to go. Now, you can transact Bitcoin to the XRPL. You can use Lightning. They're kind of the same thing. They're both off-chain processes. And if you actually want to withdraw or reconcile on-chain, you still have to go through the 30-minute waiting process of doing Bitcoin. Basically, when you're sending through Lightning or you're sending through XRPL, as far as I understand it, you're just sending an IOU. And actually, to redeem that IOU, you still have to wait. You still have to go through the painful Bitcoin redemption process, which is slow and unworthy. So Bitcoin by itself on-chain can only process 7 transactions per second. But the reason that there's not nearly as many unconfirmed transactions, and Bitcoin transactions right now don't cost as much as they used to back in 2017 or like during the 2017 bull run, even though there's a lot more transactions right now, is because of Segwit. And I think a lot of miners don't like Segwit because it kind of cuts into their profits. Segwit, initially what it does is it segregates certain data from the transactions, notably like the signature data. It unlocks it and puts it somewhere else, and that allows you to squeeze many more transactions per block, which actually speeds up the entire chain. So it's not an off-chain solution. It's an actually on-chain solution that just speeds up the process of the chain. And last I checked, a lot of the exchanges actually started supporting Segwit. They really started supporting Segwit in February of 2018, but now I think it's gotten around 40 or 50% support. About 40 or 50% of all Bitcoin solutions use Segwit, and I know that a lot of large exchanges like OKX have actually have supported Segwit as well. And Segwit just makes the whole chain a lot faster, but it's still not fast enough. I think the theoretical maximum output, according to one of these papers for Segwit, is around 27 transactions per second. Now that's several times faster than what Bitcoin was, especially in the midst of the 2017 bull run, which is where the push for Segwit adoption actually came from. Remember, Segwit is not an off-chain solution like Lightning or like XRPL. It's an on-chain solution that strips out a lot of the signature data and puts it at the end, and puts it as a separate structure in the end, so they can actually squeeze more data per block and achieve more transactions per second. Now, I think on average, Segwit is about 2 to 2.5 times faster than the original Bitcoin blockchain. So it doesn't really solve the problem altogether. You're still averaging not quite even 20 transactions per second at maximum. But right now, looking at how much they're actually transacting on the Bitcoin blockchain, I mean, if you look at TronScan, Tron's one of the most used blockchains out there. In terms of like average transactions per second, Tron's actually one of the Tron's actually one of the most used per second. I mean, most used blockchains out there, and you can see like it in terms of TPS. I mean, it's only at around 20 or 21 usually. Sometimes, a lot of times, it's even lower than that. And if you look at that, I mean, you're looking at millions of transactions per day. Now, most blockchains don't nearly have that much. EOS has a lot of spam transactions. So if you go to block activity, EOS actually has a lot of spam transactions. So it's always number one. I don't think that represents like how much EOS actually has. Tron also has a lot of like little crappy gambling transactions. So generally, the TPS for Tron is far above anything. It's far above a lot of these other big ones. Like, you can see it's a far above Ethereum, but Ethereum doesn't have those crappy gambling apps on it. So Tron is running at maybe right now about 22 transactions per second, and it can handle a maximum on this network of 748. After the Sun network's gotten on, they can handle a lot more. But Tron has, like, I would say like 95 of Tron's transactions are little crappy gambling dApps, which Bitcoin does not have to deal with. So for the transactions right now, Bitcoin can handle their transactions right now, especially with Segwit. And but if more people adopt Bitcoin, it may not be able to. So Bitcoin, in terms of transactions, it's probably only good for storing value and making big transactions like houses. Now, we know in terms of utility, Bitcoin's utility actual utility far outstrips any other coin. Probably far outstrips all the coins put together in terms of value. We know for a fact that BitPay, which is only one Bitcoin processor, processes at least $1 billion worth of Bitcoin transactions per year. Now, that's just only one Bitcoin processor. And one of the CEOs of exchanges, he estimated that 10% of Bitcoin transactions were actually for transactional value, which means buying stuff and not just speculating. Now, real Bitcoin volume, as calculated by things like OpenMarketCap, which strips out most of the volume because they see it as wash trading, is over $1 billion a day, which means there's over $100 million a day in terms of just transactions for buying stuff for Bitcoin. That doesn't actually surprise me. If BitPay by itself is $1 billion a year, which is only 3 or 4 million, you can see, I mean, I know Bitcoin is used for some remittances, especially in South America. And I know China has a platform to buy things directly in Bitcoin. Now, China doesn't have an exchange for Bitcoin because they don't want people wash trading money. But if you're using Bitcoin to buy stuff within the country, I don't really think the government cares that much because they're not taking money out of the country. China, for all it's worth, they don't really care if you buy stuff within the country with Bitcoin. They just don't want you like trading cryptocurrency for RMB, their fiat currency, and then using cryptocurrency and RMB and say like USD to actually wash trade RMB with USD. So they're not going to allow cryptocurrencies for remittances. They're not going to allow something like WorldWire or XRapid, but they don't actually mind if you just like buy a car, let's say, with Bitcoin within the country. And a lot of some rich Chinese people actually do that. So Bitcoin's transaction, they're saying like, in tens of millions or hundreds of millions a day in terms of just transactional value. But the thing is, that's not too many transactions per second, because Bitcoin transactions are usually fairly large transactions. The fee for Bitcoin is very high, so if you're doing a $10 transaction, there's no point in transacting through Bitcoin. Now, the amount of fees I have to pay from exchange to exchange is fairly low. It's like $5, but if you want to withdraw from address to address, it is a little higher right now. And that's because that's just the rate that miners charge, and you really can't do anything about that. Miners generally don't like Segwit because it cuts into their fees. And I don't think you can actually change the Bitcoin protocol anytime soon to actually restructure it. So the best thing you could possibly do to the protocol is actually implement Segwit 100%, bring the transactions per second up to about 20, and that would solve the problem probably for the next 2 or 3 years. But you can't really use Bitcoin because of the lack of transactions per second, even if you brought it up to 20 for everyday transactions like you can use Visa. So that's how fast Bitcoin actually is right now. If you use the on-chain solution. 7 transactions per second right now for just the Bitcoin, but if you Segwit everything, you can probably bring it up pretty close to 20 or at least 17, 18, which would actually relieve a lot of the congestion. The Bitcoin unconfirmed transactions, I remember at the height of the last bull run, were at like 200,000 unconfirmed Bitcoin transactions, and you can actually see that it's actually a lot less now. There's only 4,457 unconfirmed. So the fees for Bitcoin are much lower than what it was last time. So Bitcoin's actually in a much healthier place than in 2017. But the problem with Bitcoin is the room to expand is actually quite low, and your ceiling without using off-chain solutions is maybe like 20 transactions per second, even with Segwit. Now, if you can either vote to increase the block size, or just limit yourself to those number of transactions, or you can use an off-chain solution, but then you still have to reconcile on-chain. So that doesn't really solve anything. So that's the report for Bitcoin today. That's why I don't think Bitcoin will really be used for everyday transactions because of the limitations on transactions per second. I think you need like a third generation coin or a coin maybe like Bitcoin Cash with slightly bigger blocks. I think Bitcoin SV's thing with gigabyte blocks is retarded because that introduces so many problems like memory management and all that stuff onto the coin that you're going to have like a lot of data leaks. You're going to have like massive amounts of problems if you do like 2 gigabyte blocks. Plus, if each block is 2 gigabytes, that would take a massive amount of a hard drive to store all that information across all the blocks. So I don't think that's a solution. I think Bitcoin Cash is sort of a sweet spot around 32 megabytes per second. That can handle, if you Segwit it can probably handle like, about 1,000, maybe 500 to 1,000 transactions per second. And I think that can take care of a lot of transactions. Obviously, a solution like XRP, Stellar, or Nanotron, any of those third generation blockchains can actually do thousands of transactions per minute. And eventually, I think one of those will be everyday transactions. I don't think for everyday transactions you want a coin that burns itself. And if you really want a world currency with cryptocurrency, which I actually don't think is going to happen, I think they're going to just introduce a stable coin backed by a basket of world currencies to be, if they ever have a world currency, which I don't think they will. But that's my thing on Bitcoin, how many transactions it can have, how many possible transactions they can have if everything was on Segwit. And I think they should get everyone to adopt this thing because once we have another run-up, Segwit would help release the congestion, and we could actually like kind of not have these Bitcoin jams for as long as possible, going from 7 transactions per second to maybe 20 transactions per second on the blockchain, which is actually enough for everyday transacting right now. But anything can happen if a bull run happens. So that's the news report for today. Let me know what you think. Thank you and have a nice day.